All right, good afternoon once again, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vanessa Jaravaza, and I'll be the moderator for the lecture today. I apologize for the slight delay in the commencement of this program, but we will move. I'd like to acknowledge our honorable members of parliament present here, our government officials, our esteemed Aphrodite Board of Trustees, our esteemed comrades, and everyone present. Welcome to the OPA lecture, and thank you for attending. The OPA lecture series is a distinguished lecture series established by Aphrodite, the African Forum and Network on Data and Development, in honor of Opa Kapinji-Mpanga, who is widely regarded as one of the pioneers of African debt advocacy. He founded Aphrodite in 1994 and has spent decades working on issues of sovereign debt, development planning, aid effectiveness, and African economic policy. The purpose of this lecture series aims to promote critical reflection on Africa's debt challenges, examine the relationship between debt, development, and global financial governance, advance African-led alternatives to the current international financial architecture, and encourage debate on economic sovereignty, fiscal responsibility, and structural transformation in Africa. The lecture series is a curtain raiser to Aphrodite's flagship event, the African Conference on Debt and Development, AFCOD. It is designed to set the intellectual and political tone for the broader conference, bringing together a prominent thinker or activist to deliver a keynote address that challenges the conventional narratives on African debt, sovereignty, and development. The lecture series sits at the heart of Aphrodite's push to reframe Africa's debt crisis, not as a technical financial problem, but as a matter of historical justice. Kapinji-Mpanga himself made a resounding call for Africans to seize control of their own transformation journey and map out how Africa can move from being primarily a rule taker to becoming a rule maker in global finance. The lecture series was formally launched at the Third African Conference on Debt and Development, AFCOD 3, in Dakar, Senegal, in August 2023. The inaugural lecture was delivered by Opa Kapinji-Mpanga himself on the theme, Debt Sustainability in the Context of African Dependency and Underdevelopment, arguing that to genuinely achieve debt sustainability, Africa must break free from the current chains of dependency and underdevelopment. The lecture at AFCOD 5 in 2025 in Accra, Ghana, was delivered by Roger Mackenzie, international editor of the Morning Star and author of African Uhuru. Mackenzie argued that Africa's liberalization and liberation must come from within, and warned against reliance on external saviors. The Opa Kapinji-Mpanga lecture series stands as a tribute to a man whose life's work has been dedicated to building Africa's collective capacity to confront and resolve its debt challenges. By naming the lecture after this founder, Aphrodite ensures that the values of Pan-African solidarity, intellectual rigor, and advocacy for African nations remain central to its annual conference, making the lecture not just an opening ceremony, but a statement of purpose. I would like to acknowledge and call upon our respondents for the session today. That is Dr. Leila Latif. If you could please come on stage. I'd also like to call Mr. Martin Ntokeo to also come on stage. and Miss Faith Lumonya. Please join me on stage. Thank you. You can come. Take a seat. In any format. The theme for today's OPA lecture is the African public debt crisis from an economic sovereignty perspective, going beyond the symptoms. The speaker argues that the debt crisis in Africa is a symptom of the fundamental problem of lack of economic sovereignty. The concept of economic sovereignty is used in this paper to show that the recurring public debt crisis on the continent is only a manifestation of the deeper challenge of low levels of the ability to take decisions that secure the economic interest of African countries. In this context, it is argued that political sovereignty without economic sovereignty amounts to little more than the symbolism of a national anthem, a flag, a sitting National Assembly, etc. He also discusses the 4 dimensions of economic sovereignty: monetary and fiscal autonomy, productive capabilities, effective control over natural resources, and energy and food securities. These 4 key areas are what are at the root of the public debt in Africa. Allow me to welcome our speaker, Professor Homan Chitonge. He is a professor at the Center for African Studies and Research Associate at PRISM School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. He's also a visiting professor at African Studies Center in the Tokyo University and also in the Global Justice Program at Yale University. He serves as the chief editor for the African Research Bulletin Journal published by Wiley. His research interests include economic development in Africa, agrarian political economy, water supply, social welfare, poverty and inequality, and alternatives for Africa's economic growth. His most recent publications include Industrial Policy and the Transformation of the Colonial Economy in Africa, the Oxford Handbook of the Zambian Economy, and Reclaiming Economy Sovereignty in Africa, which was published in Anthem Press in 2025. Allow me to welcome Professor Homan Chitonge.
I rise on the protocol that was given earlier. And I would like to start by saying thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak at this important gathering today. I'd like to thank particularly Theo and his team who organized and invited me to be here. I also would like to express my deep gratitude for being given an opportunity to honor Mr. Opa Kabijimpanga, who I think is one of the towering voices in Africa in terms of advocacy for not just debt justice, but I think the transformation of the African economy. So I'm really honored, Opa, to be giving this lecture in your honor. May I just ask Opa to stand for those who might not know you? Just, I know most people would know you, but just, that's Opa Kabijimpanga. Yeah, So when I was asked if I could give a lecture and in his honor, I had no hesitation. I said, absolutely, I'll do that, and I feel very honored today. I won't read Opa's bio. It has already been given. But just to mention one or two things. One of it is that, so I was asking Opa, I said, what do you want me to say about you? And he said to me, he defined himself as I am a Pan-Africanist. And I think most of us would share that definition, that we are Pan-Africanist, and we are looking out for the transformation of the African continent. So Opa's life was just giving me a little bit of brief of that, has taken him from government into civil society, into development banking, a little bit of academia, and so on. So we are very, very proud to be doing this lecture in your honor, Opa. Now, to speak about the lecture that we're giving today, I want to focus on. I want to speak about the link between debt and economic sovereignty. And for me to be able to do that link, I am going to speak firstly about the debt problem, just to outline what is the debt crisis on the continent. And I want to show that the debt crisis actually we've entered from the 80s, mid-70s up to now, we've entered into what some authors describe as a permanent public debt crisis. So it hasn't gone away from the 1970s. We've always, at some point we patch on it, but it doesn't go away. And I want to argue that the reason why it hasn't gone away is because we haven't been responding to the root causes of the problem. And I want to argue in the lecture that the root causes of the problem lies fundamentally in the fact that the African continent lacks economic sovereignty. So what I do in the lecture is to, first of all, speak to debt and then outline what exactly is this economic sovereignty and how should we understand it and how does it relate to debt, public debt. So I make that connection. So when you speak about economic sovereignty, of course, you outline it, the most obvious thing to do, a logical thing to do is to then say, how can Africa then reclaim economic sovereignty? But I'm not doing that in this lecture today, partly because Theo put me on another panel tomorrow, and I was thinking to myself, if I speak about everything today, then what will I say tomorrow? So I'm reserving that for tomorrow. I'll reserve the question of how can Africa then capture or strengthen its sovereignty to the panel discussion, which will happen tomorrow. So I'm not sure if this is on. Is it on? Can you try and move the slide? The slides don't want to move. If we could move to the next slide, please. Yeah, so I want to start by just saying that the what I said earlier, that the debt crisis is not something new. It's a recurrent problem for the African continent. And we have different views of explaining why this has been a recurring. Sorry, which one is that? I'll give you an indication when I want to change, if you can change for me. Yeah, so there have been three ways in which this debt problem has been explained, on public debt particularly on the continent. One of the most dominant ways of explaining the debt problem has been the view that the public debt is a result of mismanagement, fiscal indiscipline, and corruption. And you can see here, I'm quoting the IMF comment on Zambia debt crisis when Zambia defaulted in 2020. And there they explain that this is a result of years of fiscal indiscipline, of fiscal, years of fiscal indiscipline and mismanagement and poor governance and corruption, which is, manifested in consistent fiscal deficits and high spending of wages and subsidy and so on and so forth. So that's one view. There is another view that says actually the debt crisis on the continent is a result of the biased international financial system. That the international financial system is biased against the continent. And here, one of the examples of that view is actually the Secretary General himself, Antonio Guterres, in 2023, wrote that actually African governments borrow at interest rates that are 4 times the rate at which the US borrows, and sometimes 8 times at the rate that Germany borrows. And just imagine that you're borrowing 4 times, at interest rate 4 times higher than what the average country is paying. So they see that is a big problem, and it simply drives, it creates what we call a debt default lending system. And the default lending is a system where you are lending not with a view that somebody who is borrowing will come out of debt, but that at some point they'll default. And so it's very clear from what we have seen on the continent over the particularly this round of date. And then there's a third explanation that looks at the debt problem as essentially a problem of the lack of structural transformation, but also the historical factors that hold Africa at ransom. And in this paper, as I said, I want to argue that when we look more at debt, it's actually a symptom of a much deeper problem, the problem of lack of economic sovereignty. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, so just a little bit about the date. For those for the younger people who might not remember what was happening earlier in the 70s. That the first debt crisis, of course, was sparked by the first oil crisis in 1973. And was a problem of, and it resulted to African economies having, serious problems that led them actually to go to the IMF and the World Bank for assistance. And I'm quoting there the famous or infamous Berg report that used that crisis actually to introduce structural adjustment programs. And they cited, looked that there are many problems that the continent was experiencing and so on. And just to get a little bit of the numbers there, back, for instance, that the crisis was evident in the fact that, the region as a whole, in terms of debt, rose from 1.5 in 1970, $1.5 billion to $8 billion in 1980. And then, you had other indicators like the share of debt service in total export rising from 6 to 12% over the same period of time. And with all these kind of problems, by the end of the 80s, and I'm quoting the UNECA report there in 1989, saying 30 African countries by the end of that were in economic ICU, being treated through structural adjustment programs. And the key problem with those programs, again, was that the African countries were only able to borrow money to service the debt without any investments allowed. And that, of course, doesn't allow you to build capital, to build the capacity to pay back and get out of debt. Next slide, please. And because we didn't deal with the root cause of the problem, we have this. You can see that what I was talking about was the 70s and the 80s. This is actually just happening now. And the debt crisis, of course, a bit lower in the 70s in the early 2000s, about 2005, 2006, when the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative under the Highly Indebted Poor Country HIPC initiative were administered. You could see that this is for the whole continent, falling, just below 20%. As we speak now, debt levels have gone up to over 60%. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is just a view of some of the countries, and we take stock of between 2010 and 2022, and you can see that except the DRC, all the other countries, and these are 18 countries that were regarded to be in debt distress by the IMF by 2019. And you can see that the ratio of public debt to GDP has been growing in all countries, with some of the high ones like Mozambique and Zambia and Ghana and so on. And of course, this led to the default of 5 countries just in the last 5 years. Zambia was the first one, followed by Chad, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Sudan. Next slide, please. And I want to make this as a point of argument for the lecture, that the problem actually, however, is not the ratio of public debt to GDP. If that was the problem, then we would have a debt crisis in the US. We would have the debt crisis in Japan. We will have a debt crisis in Italy. If you compare those levels of debt, indebtedness, they will have actually more debt crisis. But they are not. Why? They have a higher, look at Japan, almost 300% of GDP in debt. The US, actually last week, they reached $40 trillion in debt, which was equivalent to 130% of GDP. But they are not in debt crisis. Why? When the African countries you saw, we were at, on average 62%, but we are in debt crisis. Why? That's a question we need to be asking ourselves, why? And this is the point I want to make, that debt is just a symptom of something deeper. Because if the ratio of debt to GDP was the main determinant of the public debt crisis, these guys here, all of them would be in crisis. You can see the African average there, 62, which is the lowest of them all. And I want to argue that the other countries you're seeing there, they are not in debt crisis because they have economic sovereignty. They have economic sovereignty. And I want to speak to what exactly is that economic sovereignty. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I want to spend a little bit more time. So this is just different people who speak about what economic sovereignty. Next slide, please. And what they say there is simply that economic sovereignty is the freedom for a country to take hold of its economic destiny. And not just the freedom, but also to create the resiliency to stand against shocks. Because shocks will come, right? External shocks will come. Prices of goods and services could fall, geopolitical would fall, but you need to create, for a sovereign country, they need to create that resiliency to stand and revive after the shock. And I want to start with this, in terms of explaining economic sovereignty. We start from the root word, national sovereignty. Now, national sovereignty, this is just a framework, has two components. There's a political sovereignty where you are recognized by other states in the international system that you are a sovereign entity in yourself. So that's political. And there's the things that are associated with political sovereignty is control of your territorial and the ability to administer, to issue laws and so on in your particular territory. And we are very familiar with that, so I won't go into much detail. My focus will be on economic sovereignty. And economic sovereignty has two components in this. And this comes from my last year's book, but I've a little bit added two other components to make the four of them, and I'll go through that quickly. Economic sovereignty, the first leg that stands on is what we call fiscal, monetary, first of all, monetary and fiscal sovereignty. And I'll speak to what exactly monetary and fiscal sovereignty entails. But related to that, and very crucial, is the freedom to build your productive capabilities, because monetary sovereignty does not last without a productive base or without strong productive capabilities. And so, I'm quoting here from one of the greatest, Algerian political economy, Mohamed Bejoua, an international law scholar, saying that political sovereignty without economic sovereignty doesn't amount to anything. That it's a symbolism that gives you a flag, a national anthem, a sitting parliament, but it doesn't give you the real powers. The real power remains with economic sovereignty. That if you can master the control of the resources to strengthen your economy, that is when you can actually have more political sovereignty. That the political sovereignty we received in the 1960s when we got our independence doesn't actually give us the real sovereignty. We don't have that. And I'm quoting here, again in Nkrumah, in that speech at the opening, at the inaugural speech of the founding of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa in 1963. He was saying that we are learning now that political sovereignty is not enough. Already, just a few years into that. So it's important for us to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. And here, just to a few points, just to illustrate a little bit more on political sovereignty, that in the scholarship on economic sovereignty, what you find most is the discussion on monetary sovereignty. And monetary sovereignty is tied to the idea of a sovereign issuer of the issuer of a sovereign currency. And this is an old idea, that the sovereign currency principle, that what defined a sovereign in the old days, particularly in the Westphalian system of states, was the ability to issue a currency. And you would find that it's the sovereign herd that would be on that particular currency. But what I want to argue here is that actually economic sovereignty is much broader than just controlling your monetary affairs. That is much broader, and we should think about, particularly on the African continent. It's broader than monetary sovereignty, and it includes issues of productive capabilities, but also the issue of control over natural resources, because that control over natural resources is what gives you the ability to, the autonomy, actually to build stronger macroeconomic foundations. But the other point I want to make is that, however, economic sovereignty does not mean that you create an autarky. Autarky meaning that a closed economy that does not interact with others. Economic sovereignty simply means that you are in control of the decisions that are based on the interest of the country, including the resources that are in that particular country. So so the argument for economic sovereignty, particularly in the context of globalization, is not that we close off Africa from the rest of other people, but that Africa is given power to determine the terms of its insertion into this global economy, but also, as Opa Kabejimpanga has argued, that Africa becomes a rule maker, not just simply a root taker in the global system. And that requires you to have that sovereignty. So lack of sovereignty then manifests itself in the various forms of dependencies. And I'll speak to that in a moment. Dependency on foreign technology, dependency on foreign aid, dependency on foreign capital that comes to develop, dependency on export of commodities. Those create the vulnerabilities that lead to you losing that sovereignty. Next slide, please. And so I want to explain a little bit more and expanding on the 4 pillars of economic sovereignty. Some of them we've spoken about. There's monetary sovereignty and fiscal. Monetary and fiscal, I put those together. And then there's autonomy to build productive capabilities, and I'll speak to what those are. And then there's the food and energy security is also an important part. And this is emerging actually in the last 3-4 years when we have had serious supply chain disruptions through wars, the COVID-19, but also the geopolitical tensions. And that has brought that, because you can't be a sovereign if you have no food. If your children are starving, you have not much control over what happens. Somebody would come and tell you, do ABCD for me to give you the food. And that's a loss of sovereignty. And I'll speak to just some of the indicators we use to calculate that. And then the control of natural resources. And you can see that these 4 pillars actually are interlinked. That you can't build productive capabilities without control of your natural resources, because the capabilities to produce something are based on what you have, your wealth. And the interesting thing, as we'll see, is that the African continent is the richest continent on the planet. The richest, by all means. Whether you talk of water resources or mineral resources, and now, actually, in terms of labor supply. But we still remained one of the poorest spots on the planet. Partly because we're not joining these dots together to create a stronger control over our economic affairs. Next slide, please. So monetary sovereignty, and so what I have just to start with here, on the left, on your left there, is the repo policy trend in the US, the one on top, and the one at the bottom is the South African repo, the policy rate. And you can see that South Africa has actually been mimicking the US. When they drop interest rates, you drop. When they raise interest rates, you raise. Okay, that would make sense if South Africa has the same economic structure or same economic profile as the US, because the interest rate plays a very big role in determining where the economy is going, and is a very central instrument. Now, if you are following what others are doing, does that give you, are you responding to the same challenges? The US is doing that on the back of inflation that is below, on the back of unemployment that is below 4% earlier on. It's going up, but it's still below 5%. South Africa, you are doing the same thing that the US is doing at an employment rate that is over 33%. It doesn't make sense to me that you should be following. They are responding to different kind of, and that in itself, of course, monetary sovereignty is, an interest rate is one instrument where you can do that. But there is also another element of monetary sovereignty that we can speak to, which is the reserve, that the currency that the African governments issue are not, we don't hold reserves in our own currency. Yeah, that the reserves we hold are in yen, in pounds, in dollars. Of course, the dollar is the dominant. What does that do? What that does, that it takes away the power. Because remember that a sovereign is a sovereign because he has the power to issue a sovereign currency. In other words, the currency we issue on the continent are not sovereign. Why are they not sovereign? They are not sovereign because we have given up power, but also we are not producing enough to make them stronger so that they can be demanded elsewhere. Imagine of an African currency where people who are coming, people all over the world will hold their reserves. Of course, the the reserves that are held by the central bank are for liquidity purposes, but also for supporting the local currency. So one aspect of this is that we are not issuing sovereign currency. There's no African currency that is listed as a major reserve currency. Yeah, meaning that our currencies don't have that strength, don't have the power, the sovereignty. There is also another question that is related to that, is that the African continent has the largest proportion of its reserves outside. You know, holding a reserve is one thing, but where do you keep your reserve? Yeah, where do African Reserve Bank keep their reserve? And the surprising thing is that the majority or the largest portion of African reserves, of course, outside of the monetary gold reserves, that they are kept in Europe and America in what they call the safe accounts. And last year I had a discussion with 3 former Reserve Bank governors on the continent. Former Reserve Bank governor of Tanzania, Zambia, and Botswana. And they were acknowledging that actually we don't keep the reserves here. We only have a credit entry on the treasury, but the money is actually kept in Switzerland and in the US. And the funny thing is that we go back to borrow the same money that is kept in Switzerland at interest rates that is 4 times, 8 times what others are borrowing the money from. It's our own money, but we give it to Switzerland and we go back to borrow. It really doesn't make sense. So I was asking them, why were you doing that? And they said, no, because we invest because reserves are a liquidity asset. So you need it in a form that can easily be turned into money when you need it. Yeah, and because of the liquidity things, so they were saying because they're not bankable or liquid projects on the continent, that's why we take them to other countries. And I was saying, but how can it be that on the entire continent we have no bankable projects? There are others that are coming from outside and they see bankable projects and invest. Because much of the investment on the continent comes from outside. So there's a contradiction. And they admitted that is a problem. We need actually to make that money more available in the local economy so that we can boost investments, but also defend the local currency as we reduce the pressure on the external account. And so I was saying, but when you were the governors, you never told us this story. And they say to me, that is actually politically suicidal for a Reserve Bank governor to say to you that that you should keep money in your local account. But those are issues of monetary sovereignty. Where is your sovereignty? You are issuing a currency that is your own, and then you use it to buy other currencies to store elsewhere. That's a huge problem. Next slide, please. This is a story that speaks to what I was saying earlier, that in the current financial system, international financial system, you have what we call the hierarchy of currencies. And you can see that at the top there is the US dollar. At the pyramid, the apex of that structure is the US dollar. And related here, you can see that the US dollar, or maybe not so much, 56% of the reserves. This is 2025. Of course, the US dollar is losing a little bit of that ground because it was 72% in 2010. But of course, with the new dynamics around de-dollarization. But still, just all the countries hold their liquid assets in US dollars, and 56 or 57% of the $13 trillion in reserves are held through the US dollar. And then the next is the euro at 20%, and then the Japanese yen and the British sterling, and a little bit of China. China is making inroads, but it's not big yet. And what that means is that there's no African currency that is visible there which other people want to hold their assets in. Until we transform that and make our currency something that others can see as stable, we won't have that economic sovereignty. We'll always be going outward. Next slide, please. So we've spoken about economic sovereignty. I want to speak a little bit about productive capabilities, because productive capabilities are related to monetary and fiscal sovereignty, in the sense that even if you make your currency strong, if your Kenyan shilling is strong today, you can say, okay, I'll peg it to the dollar at 5 to a US dollar. Without productive capabilities, that won't be sustained. Over time, it will start losing value, and by the end of the month, it has gone back to 120, 125. Yeah. So productive capabilities are very, very crucial in sustaining monetary and fiscal sovereignty. And we define productive capabilities as, the capacity of countries, or the capability to create the production, the muscle to produce goods and things. In simple terms, that we create the capacity to make things. And so things like manufacturing become very crucial in this. And it's a capacity actually to make full utilization of our natural wealth. And I should underline the word full there, because we do utilize our natural resources, but not in full value. When cocoa from Ghana is harvested, it's not utilized fully in Ghana. It is shipped to somewhere else, and that's where the value is done. So Belgium and Switzerland, they fry the beans, and they add a few things, and they capture 85% of the value. Ghana, as a country, gets at most 5% of that value. And you partly because you don't have the productive capabilities to utilize and exploit your natural resources fully. And productive capabilities in the economy are actually needed for us to transform, the issue of transforming the structure of the African economy. For us to begin to strengthen the value addition processes on the continent, we have to build the factories. We have to build we have to bring in the equipment. We have to build the infrastructure. We have to build the skills that we need for that, both labor skills, but also entrepreneurial skills that can help us, because the capabilities are not just physical, but there is a soft part to that, including skills and technology and research and development and so on and so on. And I would argue that once you build the strong productive capabilities, you are on the road to sustaining your economic sovereignty, because you can make your money strong. You can also have more control on what happens to your natural resources. And you can also even have more control over the food supply, food and energy supply. Yeah. So very, very, very critical. Next slide, please. So the UNCTAD just developed what they call it productive capacity index. And they measure that in different, they use 8 different components that I'll speak to just now to create the index. And what you can see here is that for the African continent, that's the lowest productive capability index. And then in terms of exploitation of natural resources, which are actually inverse. If you have a strong productive capability, you have a higher index there and a lower index here. But here, the African continent is leading because most of our production is based on extraction of raw materials. Next slide, please. And this is just part of the measuring of what capabilities are. We look at the value added of manufacturing in total export. And here we are comparing different regions of the world. You can see here that the African continent, again, the lowest. And the trend is downwards. If we trace. And that is not, we shouldn't be having that. This should be going up so that we catch up. Because it is in making those things that help you to build those capabilities. Next slide, please. And then one of the critical indicators we use is the manufacturing value added per capita. So we use per capita to normalize the indicator there by population. And you can see here that if you take the African population and divide by the value added from manufacturing, you get about 226 in 2024. But each African would generate per year. Those are annual figures. We generate only 226. And compared to other countries, even Latin America at $1.1 thousand, and Asia and so on, OECD at 5, and the highest the EU at 6 and plus. the average, the global average at almost 2,000 is 10 times the African average. Next slide, please. And that, of course, in itself is showing that we have very low productive capabilities on the continent. The food and energy sovereignty is important, as I said, in the current context where we are seeing the geopolitical shifts having a huge impact on national food security, but also energy security. And I'm showing here the import bill for the African continent. So, that you can see this is food import. The bill has been rising and steadily rising, and last year it was $114 billion. And if we aggregate and see what kind of foods that we are importing, the next slide, please. If we aggregate the kind of foods that we are importing, most of them are actually foods that we can produce ourselves. Cereal takes up almost 20% of that. And the other key problem here in terms of that sovereignty is the last part here, that we are actually importing more food from, 75% of it come from outside the continent, and we're only importing from each other 14%. And for a sovereign, an African food sovereign regime should actually invert this, that we import less from outside. And the funny thing is that the African continent has a wide ecological resource on which you can produce all these things that we are importing. Importing, wheat and maize. Wheat and maize only make up almost 30% of that bill that I was showing there earlier. Again, that is in itself showing that if there is any disruption in Ukraine, where we're getting wheat, if there's any disruption in Iran, where we're getting oil, the continent is on its knees. And being on its knees meaning that you have lost power. You have no autonomy. You can't go to Ukraine and say, we have come to get the food. You should just at the mercy of somebody. So if we can revert that, then we will have resiliency and we will reduce the vulnerability that come in that regard. Next slide, please. Energy as security is also another indication. And energy security rests on two things: the reliability of supply, but also the immunity from volatility of prices. And as you can see, perhaps the Iran war has demonstrated that we are very vulnerable to that. And what you see there is that although the import of oil has been declining, but oil products have been growing. The amber part of the circle has been growing partly because we ship oil out and then we import the oil products, which is actually, the continent can be self-sufficient in oil. And perhaps some of the initiatives we have seen, I'm not sure, very familiar with that story of Dangote opening a refinery here, can change that dynamic. Because the opening of a refinery won't just produce petrol or diesel, it will produce other byproducts. And then we can become a little bit self-sufficient in terms of that. Next slide, please. Natural resources. And natural resources are important because your productive capabilities won't go anywhere without a leg in the natural resources that you have. Your cobalt in the DRC, your graphite in Guinea, your uranium in Burkina Faso. Those resources, we need to control them in a way that allows us to exploit the full value of those resources. And you can see here that there are several, again, as I'll repeat this, that the African continent is probably the richest in terms of those mineral resources. And if we can, so one in the international law, we express that sovereignty in terms of the permanent sovereignty over natural resources, and it's linked to self-determination. So it's very critical that you can't have self-determination if you have no control over that. But of course, in terms of economic sovereignty, we want to make sure that we add value and we get as much as we can. And also that we reduce the dependency on one or two minerals, because that also links into the public debt crisis. Because the public debt crisis occurs because you are selling on copper. And when the price of copper falls, your revenue tumbles. And you can't then meet your external account obligations. You go to borrow. And ultimately that leads to, for the African continent, that ultimately leads to the public debt crisis. At some point. It doesn't come immediately, but it will come. And so if you can diversify the economy and use, and not, there's just not one product. We have so many products in these countries that we can use to increase that sovereignty. And I'm quoting again there, Julius Nyerere saying, a true liberated nation is a self-reliant nation, one which has freed itself from economic and cultural dependency on other nations. It doesn't mean that you're not completely interacting with others, but you're not dependent on them, that you can stand on your own without them. If at some point they decide that we're not with you, you can say, okay, fine, I will survive. And that's the idea of economic sovereignty. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, so Africa's natural resources, again here, it is, I want to play that clip there, President Cyril Ramaphosa speaking about what is happening at the moment. Can we play that clip? Is it possible to play the clip? It's just about 1.5 minutes. It can play. Okay. And as we wait for that, there is a quote here from the Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni about the situation of coffee and tea on the continent. So he gives us a bit of what that is, that the African continent, from all the tea that it processes and so on, gets very little from that value, partly because we are not adding value on the African continent. If it can play, we can move to the next slide. I don't want to belabor that, but we can see and speak. Volume. Okay, no, it's fine. Let's move on. Let's move on. We can move to the next slide. It's fine. Yeah. So again, this is just more on on a little bit of a technical side. It's not a very important part. But how do we assess economic sovereignty? And there are three words, the different words, but I've mentioned two here. That we can have what we call internal economic sovereignty, and we look at things like your national budget, tax revenue, the domestic public debt, and so on and so forth. And we can also have the external dimensions of your economic sovereignty, where we look at trade balance, foreign reserves, and the size of your public external debt. That's one way of doing it, and a lot of people have produced numbers on that. The other way of looking at it is in a more sort of a strategic way, is to look at sovereignty, the dimension of proactive sovereignty. Proactive sovereignty is a type of strategy where you are saying we are creating a dynamism in the economy. We're creating a dynamism in the economy that can make us more resilient against shocks. And so, as the name suggests, proactive, meaning that you are anticipating and you build against that. And there is also the other dimension is the dimension where you're looking at internal objectives of the economy and creating capacity for you to improve and reducing external debt and so on. And then, of course, the defensive one is where you are creating situations where you can defend the sovereignty against external shocks. Next slide, please. This is just the economic sovereignty index that has been created. And what I've done there is to show you the top 10 out of 100, so the 100 countries, 101 countries assessed, and the top 10 are on your right, and in the middle we have the top 10 Africa and their index and the ranking, and then on the left here you have the top bottom. And what you notice that the top bottom 10 are all Africans, and with very low sovereignty index. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, so then how do we connect this to public debt? I think I've touched on that, so I won't belabor because my time has gone already. That the different dimensions of economic sovereignty are linked to debt. For instance, if you are not in control of your monetary and fiscal policy, you cannot claim, you cannot avoid the debt problem that it will come. But also, if you're not in full control of your natural resources, again, at some point you have problems in terms of your finances in the nation, and that will create problems with debt. So, in other words, what I'm saying here is that economic sovereignty can raise or can reduce the vulnerability to public debt crisis, as we have seen. And the last one, just to conclude there, that Africa needs then to build its sovereignty by attending to the 4 pillars that I've just mentioned, creating avenues for strengthening monetary and fiscal autonomy, creating the ability to be able to build productive capabilities, create the ability to be where we can be food and energy sovereign. Last, thank you very much. Thank you.
Many thanks to Prof. Holman Chitonge. A round of applause once again. What an insightful argument regarding debt, the debt discourse, especially towards moving towards economic sovereignty. So we'll move to our respondents, and we'll start with Dr. Leila Latif, and then we'll proceed with Ms. Faith Lumoya, and then we'll go to Mr. Martin. Yes, so we'll start with you, Dr. Leila.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. I think it's always enlightening to hear about views that are truly African, that are informed by African literature, and also the data which supports the context in which we currently are, looking at our socio-economic lived realities. And I particularly like the way you have framed the concept around economic sovereignty, you know, that we need to think about monetary and fiscal autonomy, productive capability, the control of our resources, and most importantly, food security. And I think that context is really, really important because as a tax scholar, it pushes me to also rethink my understanding of what fiscal sovereignty really is. Because we can't think about fiscal sovereignty, you know, divorced from economic sovereignty. And what does this really then mean in the age of technology as we are moving on? And I really wanted to speak about a fifth dimension, because as you were speaking about that, I couldn't help but think about technology governance, and the fact that the problems we're having with technology governance is exactly the problems that you've identified in your 4 dimensions. We are not in control of the technology that is being packaged for us. We are in control of our minerals, but only at the raw material stage, not the value addition. So that again hampers that fiscal economic sovereignty going forward. When you speak about food security, I mean, when you look at the mines, the open pit, when they're just left as they are, it results in a number of human rights concerns, which is also trickling into environmental concerns, which affects the food security value chain as well. So everything seems to be really, really interconnected. And I can't help but think about compute sovereignty, because I think that's where the next big fight is as we go forward. So when we talk about compute sovereignty, like, what does that really mean? Because compute is not internet. Compute is not the digital economy. Compute is what we call industrial capacity, right? It is that physical stock It's that machines through which all this data is processed. It's the buildings that houses this data. It's the electricity that runs the entire centers. It's the cables that connect, the entire machine system. And it's the software that we are using. And when you think about it, the land is ours, the resources are ours, the minerals are ours, but the processing is not ours. The compute power is not ours. And what we're basically saying is that compute is all about processing, and the way in which we're seeing the Meta, the OpenAI, the amount of revenue that they generate. Some of the revenue they generate is more than the GDP of certain African countries. So if this is the next frontier of a valuable intermediary good that's going to run the entire global economy, and we don't have economic sovereignty over it, Professor, it simply means that as technology is reordering the African economy, in the context of the world economy, we're going to be pushed more into debt. Because if you want to have that compute power, we need to be able to free up our tax revenue to be able to get that compute power. Now, currently, our budget, our health system, our social security is all underfunded. We cannot reduce that funding anymore to free up revenue to now start investing in the tech space. So this means we then have to borrow. And again, if we are borrowing in the US dollar, what is that doing to the liquidity of our currency going forward? So it seems like there's no way out. It seems like there's no reprieve. The statistics that you showed us from the UNCTAD databases, right? The productive capacity index, the natural resource exploitation. I don't know what this is going to look like once the technological warfare actually begins. And by warfare, I don't mean fighting, between about which country gets to host the largest data center on the African soil. The conversation came to Kenya, and our president basically denied Microsoft to host their largest data center here in Olkaria. Reason being, what was told to the public is that our national grid would not be able to support that energy pull. But in actuality, it was the MOU that was basically signed that required our national treasury to pay a phenomenal amount for cloud services to host Microsoft here, which our budget would not allow. So again, where goes our economic sovereignty within this age of compute? Because when I think about compute sovereignty, for me, it's the ability of a state to be able to administer what processing happens in its jurisdiction, under whose infrastructure, under whose laws, and whether our countries will have that power to be able to, allocate a portion of that value that is being processed. But currently, when you look at the technological infrastructure that we have, it's not ours. We license it. We pay for it. The undersea cables, none of them are African, right? They're licensed somewhere else. We're paying for those landing cables. When you look at the rules, it's not like Kenya has a statute that says, Technology Governance Act. We don't. But when it comes to regulating technology, it's not even sovereign law. It's more about the commercial contracts, and it's also the terms of services that we sign. And these commercial contracts, these terms of services are not developed by us. They're developed outside, and they're given to us. And it's either take it or leave it. Right now, if you go and pick on an app, and it opens up its terms and conditions, if you don't say yes, you will not access that app. Now, if this is the app that we're going to be told, our revenue authorities must use this app for the purposes of collecting tax data for our citizens to be able to file their returns on, but it is not designed by our countries, the back-end technology is not with our governments. What does this mean about economic sovereignty? We don't have it, and in the age of technology, we're still not having that sovereignty going forward. So if we're thinking about Pan-Africanism, the spirit of Pan-African in terms of designing our rules, regulating ourselves, and also taxing some of these things, how then can we give economic sovereignty a more distinct, powerful definition that gets us our autonomy back? So those are some of the questions that I was thinking about, Professor, when I listened to your wonderful lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor, for those very insightful, for that very insightful presentation. I think I was. It's always interesting when economic analysis is done, that different dimensions that emerge every other time. And I think for me, the conversation around economic sovereignty is very important. And I like that you started at a point where you talked about you talked about the need for us to address the root causes of the problem. And I think that is very critical, even in the different ways in which we decide to address these issues. And I think for me, my reflections, so there are so many of them, but I'll try to pick out those that might be relevant for me to share at the moment. But I think one of the things that I really appreciated was where you started, where you talked about the fact that it's not necessarily about the indiscipline, the fiscal indiscipline within our different countries, but rather about the bias that exists within the international system. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge this, because it will help us to specifically also be able to map out who the enemy is. And when I talk about the enemy, I am referring to those that are also in many ways playing a critical role in facilitating the so-called corruption. Because when you think about the role of the IMF and World Bank, for example, within our different ministries of finance, within our central banks, part of what they do is to be able to influence a system that guarantees the interests of multinational corporations, but also the countries where a lot of these multinational corporations come from. So the US, and we've read, for instance, the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and it details part of the playbook of these different corrupt individuals. And so it's important for us to be able to approach it from that perspective. And the point that you made around the issue around addressing our production challenges is also very important, because, and I think I want to give an example. We all know the influence that AGOA had in a lot of our economies. And I come from Uganda, and there was a time when we went through a process of developing the AGOA strategy for the country. And this particular process was led by an American. And one of the things that we argued as part of the ways in which it had been structured was the question about, can AGOA contribute towards building, strengthening coffee value addition in the country? And one of the things that this particular person argued was that the Americans know a specific way in which they would like their coffee processed. And our argument was that if this would be done within the context of commercial dialogue, that the private sector that are engaged in processing of coffee would come to Uganda and partner with Ugandan coffee processors and be able to transfer that knowledge and skill, so that then we're able to earn much more from what we have always been earning from coffee, then we will be able to benefit. But his argument was that. And I think for me, it's important that we do also understand the importance of having sovereignty over the production systems, because in the end, we have been kept at the bottom because of simple arguments such as those. But ultimately, it's really about how are we able to capture the production systems, and that then brings me now to the question around financial and monetary dependency. And I like that you highlighted the point around energy and food. And we all know that every time we are importing more food, more energy, we are also demanding more forex, because the only way we are able to buy food and energy externally is if we have access to forex. And so, like Professor was explaining, ultimately, when the price of fuel increases externally, it will ultimately affect the price of different commodities within our countries. And if you have noticed over the years, you realize that the price of fuel is often equivalent, a liter of fuel, in terms of the price, is often equivalent to the price of the dollar within our different countries. And it's structured in that way to be able to maintain a certain level of control over our different economies. And we can go on to talk about foreign direct investment, about aid. And I think for me, aid, when you think about aid, for example, and the role it has played in being able to pave way, not just for private sector, but also pave way for austerity, and also ultimately pave way for further capture of our economies. And when I talk about, for instance, the issue around austerity, we know that with aid coming in, it basically weakened a lot of our systems and made our governments unable to have control over, for instance, provision of public services. And so with that inefficiency facilitated, it just basically paved way for private sector to come in. And I think being able to connect all those dots is important. Usually we celebrate the amount of remittances coming in, but remittances coming in means that there is labor, valuable, would have ideally been on the continent, creating the value that is needed for us to be able to develop. And I think the other point I wanted to also talk about is the issue of the role of our liberalized capital accounts. And I think this is something that we need to begin to also reflect on much more. In many ways, it facilitates investment, it facilitates, to a certain extent, trade, but it does have a direct impact in terms of, for instance, the fact that when foreign investors come in, if they are allowed to freely take out their profits, to freely take out their dividends, and so on and forth, it means that there is no reinvestment happening on the continent, and that then directly affects our ability to fully utilize the different resources, the different resources that we have. And that's an important point that Professor made around the issue of full utilization of our different resources. But it's really as a result of a number of other economic policies that are not facilitating this this production to happen. And I think as I conclude, As I conclude, I just wanted to make, sorry about that. I think as I conclude, I wanted to say that in the end, part of the process of achieving economic sovereignty will require us to get to a point where we also rethink the ways in which our economy is structured. And I think this is also a point that Professor made during his presentation, because our economies have been structured in such a way that they are, first of all, we are not adding value to the exports that we are taking out, but also it is the economy is structured in such a way that we are dependent on the West. And part of what needs to happen is for us to begin to think about a process of delinking and think about how do we leverage the existing market that we have, for example, within the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area. How do we leverage on South-to-South cooperation, valuable South-to-South cooperation, and not focus on the idea of exporting to Europe and exporting to the US, because that is also part of the way in which we will be able to break free economically and begin on a journey of gaining our economic independence. Thank you so much, and thank you, Professor.
Professor, I really want to thank you. I want to thank you why? Because I'm so much in agreement with you that at a certain point I asked myself, now that Professor is saying everything that I agree with, what will I be talking about when I come to respond? And I said, I need to find a way. Lucky none of you was looking at me because I was really looking for the way. Everything that he said, I agree fully. Particularly the link that you see between the 4 pillars of economic sovereignty. And the fact that you link the debt crisis to economic sovereignty wakes me up. But I have a concern. We are not decision makers. That's the trouble with us experts and professors and Professor Opa. We are not decision makers, right? When we finish this lecture, how do we get this into our leaders to turn it into something that will really help Africa get a path off this situation? And that's why I'm asking myself, after listening to Professor, I'm asking myself, what is the path that can lead Africa out of this? Or what is the path that can lead Africa toward that economic sovereignty? Unfortunately, when I ask the question, I get into more trouble because I see that even if that path is discovered, it will be paved with so much obstacles. And I see 3 levels of these obstacles. The 3 levels that I see are connected with the kind of mindset that we as leaders in Africa or decision makers in Africa have. What kind of mindset do we have in relation with each of the pillars that he presented to us? What kind of relationship do we have with our wealth in Africa? We say we are a rich continent, but what kind of relationship do we have with that, with the natural resources that we have, before we even look at how we exploit or how we use it? So what kind of relationship do we have with it? What perception do we have when we are a leader of the richness that we have in Africa? And secondly, it's about what kind of relationship do we want to have with those who are out there competing with us? Because there are people out there competing with us. I'm saying competing, that's a very light word because they are not just competing, but they are pushing us into the situation where we are to benefit more from what we have. How do we deal with that? Now, the third thing is, how do we manage administrative and governance space? Because that's where the problem is. How do we manage that? If we want to achieve the sovereignty that we're looking for, how do we manage the governance space? I will start from there. you will see with me that many of us who look at having a space in governance, we fight our whole life to try to get a space in governance, be it as a politician or as a business person. And as soon as we get into the space that we've been targeting, the journey stops there. Whereas that's where it should begin. But we stop there because when you are a politician, you fight and then you get power, you are so happy you start enjoying, and nothing happens next. So you see, if we have leaders who have behaved that way, how do we get your message through these kind of leaders? And also, I am asking myself, the mindset with our resources. When we look at our natural resources, whenever we say we're going to, when we discover something, when we discover a mineral somewhere and we say, oh, we are so happy our country will now start exploiting, the first reaction that we have as a leader is to look outward and look for support, look for help, look for the technology you were talking about, Leticia, and we want to be helped. This is an issue. This is an issue because he who comes to help you, if the person is your competitor, it means you will never have the power that gives you the sovereignty that you need. Because the sovereignty you are talking about, it is for us to go and use it with those who compete with us, right? But if we expect someone else to come and help us get the sovereignty, not only would that person not bring it, but if the person brings something, it will be something that gets you weaker. We need to think and ponder upon that. Yet, I have hope because when we look at what has happened these last years and how African leaders are behaving, we understand that they have understood there is an issue and they are looking for a solution. I'm saying this remembering the AU conference on debt, which took place in Lomé some time ago. I'm saying this remembering the meeting that we had in Addis Ababa a few weeks ago, maybe few months ago, discussing how to have a common African position on implementing the Sevilla commitment. I'm saying this looking at many other situations where our leaders met to try to get a solution. But the problem is, whenever they decide to do something, they do the wrong thing. They do the wrong thing. Is it because they want to do it? I'm not sure. Maybe they don't know that the thing that they are doing is the wrong one. So I'm going to take the example of Lomé. I went back and saw what the objectives were in Lomé when they met, the African Union met to discuss the debt situation. It was about facilitating knowledge sharing. That is great, right? Sharing knowledge among ourselves is great. It was also about formulating a position regarding the needed reforms for the international financial architecture. That too is great. But when they said, I'll go to the next one before I start commenting. The third one was to formulate innovative debt framing. To a new way of getting into debt. And then the last one was to explore and recommend practical actions and solutions. So you see, this is really great. But unfortunately, when they say knowledge sharing, that one there's nothing to say about it. And when they say formulating the needs, the needed financial architecture transformation, that's where I start having an issue, because generally they say it with a mindset of expectation. They expect their partners outside there to be kind enough to provide those needed reforms. Whereas the people out there are competitors, and they are the ones who have put in place the setting that we have now. How do we expect these people to come and give you something different when they are benefiting from the current situation? That is very difficult. That is not possible. That's not even possible if you are a good leader. You will not give up what you already have. So you see, Professor, I'm saying all of this to show the kind of challenge that we have to turn everything that you said into decision-making that goes toward the benefit of Africa. But should we just fold our arms and wait for us to go to hell? No, I don't think so. What I think is that there are ways. There are ways to do things. And I'm going to discuss this looking at one of the pillars that you took. I just picked one, the one on monetary and fiscal sovereignty. And monetary sovereignty, and you said it, it is not just about printing a currency. It's not just about printing a currency. It's about bearing in mind that the currency is just a representation of the resources that you have, or the wealth that you have. When you now peg it to your wealth, and you take the needed time to get that accepted by other people, because they will resist it. Because if today, and you started saying it, imagine today that Africa has an African currency, and all the resources in Africa are pegged on that currency. And the condition for you to have anything from Africa is to provide that currency. What will happen? People will be running for the African currency just like we run for the dollar today. When we run for the dollar, is for what? It's to come and get the African natural resources. And this is where you get other people keeping our wealth in their stores. And I think that's where we should begin to have solutions. And that kind of solution cannot be a 1 day or 2 days or even 2 decades solution. It's a long-term solution and sustained action. And that's where generally we fail to have good solutions, because it is always short-term for us. We want to see things done. You referred to Dangote, for instance. You can't imagine how difficult it has been for him just to get a refinery created in his own country. He took time. He resisted all the obstacles that he had, went up, and the refinery is there now. We need to have that in mind. Any solution for Africa will take time. And we need to stop thinking for ourselves as individuals. I can remember someone saying in the past, it was a Chinese, no matter the color of the cat, right? What matters for us is the animal to catch the mouse. Now that the cat is catching, where's that man today? Do you remember him, Deng Xiaoping? Deng Xiaoping is not here. He's not in China to benefit from it. But he said it. He said it not thinking of himself. He said it thinking of China as a place that will ever be. So maybe we need to look at Africa as a place that will ever be when we've passed away, when we've been leaders and passed away. And I think the solution lies in solidarity. Africans need to be in solidarity the way they try to implement the key aspects of economic sovereignty And that's what will transform Africa. And that transformation is not a one-day thing. It might be something that will come in 100 years, but we need to start doing it now. We must be aware and mindful that people out there are not friends, they are competitors. There is no reform we can get without really imposing the reform. And we do have means to leverage on. Our natural resources are those means, and the tools are implementing our own African financial institutions. Thank you. That's my conclusion.
Many thanks to our respondents for an valuable addition to the insightful presentation by Prof. Chitonge on the 4 pillars of economic sovereignty. It's interesting that Dr. Leila brought up the technology governance, the conversations around impact of data centers on African development, on communities in Africa. Ms. Faith then comes in with capitalizing on South-to-South cooperation, looking at assessing what indiscipline versus system bias means. And then Mr. Martin concluding with the 3-level obstacles, the mindset of Africans, the relationship with our competitors, and managing our admin and governance space. Such powerful responses and value addition to the presentation. So now we will have one round for the sake of time. We will have just one round of comments, questions.
Thank you so much. I'm Jen Narunga. I work for Siatini. Thank you so much, Prof, and the discussant. It's a great debate. And thanks, Professor, for bringing the issue of economic sovereignty when we are talking about debt. And I think if we are to exit debt, we need to look at our economy. But I think we need also to be clear that economic sovereignty is not an end in itself. We are talking about structural transformation of our economies. Again, I think it's also very, very important to dig even deeper. You say, there are more roots to uproot from this debate. For example, the issue of intra-Africa trade. Let us go beyond numbers. Let us go beyond saying that, like Faith was saying, that we need to trade internally, not to trade with Europe. We have been trading under the CFTA, the GTI. We need to understand why did tea to Ghana take 3 months from Ghana from Kenya to Ghana? What do we do to address the issue of intra-Africa trade? So we need to dig really, really deeper. The issue, Prof, of our natural resources is very true, but we have the Africa mining vision, very, very good. Almost 20 years down the road, what has happened to it? We need to understand that. And lastly, economic sovereignty is negotiated. They won't give it to us. Either IMF, the World Bank, all these geopolitical tensions we see, we won't get it on a silver plate. Do we have the capacity to negotiate our economic sovereignty or not? Lastly, economic policy without ideology is like a ship without a compass. And I think when you are discussing, Prof, the issue of economic sovereignty, the issue of ideology is very critical, because it's that ideology which anchors our policies, which will anchor our laws, which we don't have at the moment. And also, Martin, about the space, governing space. You know, when we talk about policy space, we usually talk about us as civil society. We don't have policy space. We don't have space. But even our governments don't have the space to do what, Prof, you are asking them to do. Again, we need to be able to. Lastly, you know, I'm from Uganda. The IMF offices are within the central bank. Within the central bank. How do we physically even remove the IMF from our bank, from our economy? And that will be economic sovereignty. But thank you so much. It's a very interesting debate.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you to the panelists. My name is Leo Atapu. I work with ANIJ in Nigeria. Let me congratulate my senior comrade, Opa Kabenjipanga, who's been a frontliner on the issue that we are discussing here today. And listening to Prof, I just believe strongly that the issue is beyond just mere economic sovereignty versus debt. The issue has to do with the DNA of the black man. I want to believe I'm talking to black people in this room, the sub-Saharan African people. There's a fundamental problem with the average black man. We need to change our value system. Professor identified the key issues. The issue of mismanagement of resources, corruption. What led to the huge debt profile that we are seeing? The huge debt profile we keep discussing. And in fact, Professor put it to say that it is almost a permanent issue. So it is something we'll be discussing today. In another 10 years, we'll come and discuss it. In another 30 years, we'll continue to discuss it. And that's because we have chosen. Because there is no way you become a rule maker or a rule. You will continue to take the rules if you don't change your value system. Why do you borrow and you steal it? Check around Africa leaders. Matthew, you killed the issue. That after all of this conversation, we should take it to the leaders, the political leaders, those who make the decisions. What kind of decision do they make? How are they even enthroned in the first place? What kind of democracy do we practice in sub-Saharan Africa? When 94-year-old man, we contest election over and over and win all over, win everything. On the issue of trade, I mean, we set up our African Union. Over time, we have been struggling. We cannot have common currency. Europeans came together, they said they want to establish, European Union. Over time, they took their time. They worked towards it. They achieved it. They established a common currency. What is wrong in us having a common currency? Over time, we cannot. What about the issue of trade? Africa, we have big market in Africa. If we consume our own products, we manufacture our own products, we produce them, and we sell within Africa alone, we should be able to survive as Africans. Because the man who goes to borrow, the man will always put the rules for you. You cannot give rules to the man you are going to beg money from. He is the one that will create the rules for you, and you will take it. Let us not deceive ourselves. Let us face it squarely the way it is. I've spent over 30-something years discussing debt issues, and the same issues keep reoccurring, like the Abiku child in Yoruba land. We must face it squarely. Now, remove barriers across Africa. Nigeria, Kenyans, they remove visa restriction. Kenyans will require visa to come to Nigeria. What kind of African Union is that?
Thank you, Mr. Leo.
I thank you.
Okay, there's another question here. Or comment.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Africa Chis. I'm with Christian Aid. Two quick ones. The first one is more of a reckoning. When you look at the policy autonomy aspect. It appears Africa, not me, the continent, it appears it is always adjusting and conforming itself to the different policies and paradigms actually, from austerity measures, blended financing. Now we have the green, zero transition, energy transition, whatever just aspect is there. The question of achieving independence when you are still, confined in terms of policies. Do you think that is something that we need to look into critically as a continent in terms of keeping adjusting ourselves to, to policies and paradigms that stem from, from the other world? And then lastly, the question is there an African way of trade and debt settlement? I was reading and I remember that in 2017, I think Chad owed Angola something like 100 million US dollars. And in form of settlement, they agreed. Let Chad will give Angola 75,000 herds of cattle over 10 years. And Angola will, say the debt is settled. Why do we keep, addressing ourselves to Western, managed and Western formulated modes of debt and trade settlement systems? Is there an African way of trade and debt settlement? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Africa. I'll take one more question.
Yes, muito obrigado. Eu quero falar em português.
Voilà, merci beaucoup. Je me nomme Ndongo Manekebe, je viens du Sénégal.
Sorry. Eu quero falar em português. Eu sou moçambicano, venho de Moçambique. Eu concordo plenamente com tudo que os painelistas disseram e, aliás, eu dou os meus parabéns por tudo que disseram, porque é verdade, é indiscutível, é verdade, tem evidências. Há um aspecto que eu quero acrescentar que muitas vezes não tem tido resposta. Eu vou esperar para eles porem os auriculares. Posso? Ok. Eu vou recomeçar. Eu vou dizer que eu sou moçambicano, venho de Moçambique, e tudo que os painelistas disseram, eu dou os meus parabéns porque é verdade. É isto que nós vivemos. E a pergunta continua, como é que nós vamos fazer? E particularmente a África, quando acontece, que coisa nova traz para nós irmos à luta? Porque tudo isso é verdade. Mas há uma pergunta que muitas vezes não se toca. Nos tempos tocava-se muito, mas agora ninguém toca quando a gente está em encontros como este. Desenvolvimento, economia, recursos, etc, etc. O assunto da hegemonia militar. Porque, como todos nós sabemos, há países africanos que tentaram fazer o melhor, mostrar menos corrupção, mostrar estar ao lado do povo, fazer boas recolha de receitas, pôr os nacionais a fazer o trabalho, enfim, combate para o progresso. Há países que fizeram, mas morreram. Os seus líderes morreram antes, inclusivamente, de chegar à metade do projeto. Morreram. Não foram mortos por nacionais alguns, mas fabricados lá fora. Outros foram diretamente bombardeados. Então, como é que podemos sair daí? Vamos supor que a África tivesse todas essas condições que mencionaram, que quer trabalhar, está unida, fala a mesma voz.
And we are together, we speak in unity, and we want to trade between ourselves. The military from the West will come and bombard us and destroy us. So if we don't have this military response, what would we do? Thank you so much.
Voilà, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is Ndongo Manikebe. I come from Senegal. I would like to thank a professor for your wonderful intervention. I would also like to thank other panelists. Professor, in your intervention, it talked about political sovereignty, economic sovereignty. We have a certain number of pillars. You talked about political sovereignty and economic sovereignty. But did you make a link between political sovereignty and economic sovereignty? Because it's important to make a link. It's important to make a link. For instance, if we know how elections happen in Africa, you can see that Western powers also interfere in our elections. They help choose leaders that they can manipulate, leaders who are going actually to sustain these negative policies they've imposed on us. So the political sovereignty is also linked to economic sovereignty. You also said, for instance, the issue is not the level of the debt, but rather how we reimburse this debt. So this actually brings us to ask ourselves, what do we do with this money that we borrow? We don't invest this money, and so we are not in a position to generate enough resources actually to reimburse this debt. And this is another issue. Another aspect that's important that we need to talk about is the issue of security sovereignty. In countries that have a lot of resources, we can see that they have a lot of issues. I'm thinking about the DRC that has a lot of resources. There's no security. In a lot of other countries, whenever they have big natural resources, there's a lot of insecurity. And security sovereignty is also important that should be taken into consideration. This is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Apologies. For the sake of time, we have to move on. I think we'll start with our respondents, if they would like to answer some of the questions and also respond to the comments that were made. And then we will finish with Professor Homan, who will answer the questions and also give his closing remarks. So over to you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Africa was asking if there's a way of trade and settlement. Actually, you are asking if there's a way out, right? You are asking the same question that I asked. Yes, indeed, there's a way out. And this is why I'm going to touch on one word that Professor used. He talked of autarky. I think that's a halfway toward it. The problem with us in Africa is that generally when we try to solve our problems, we don't try to see what happens if Africa was the only place in the world. What I mean is, consider Africa as the world, meaning that there's no other place. There's no person outside there to go and get support from. What would you do? We've not thought that way. And this is where the African Union and all the institutions that we have need to be leveraged. And this comes to what Leo was saying in his remark. So we need to learn to do things as Africans for Africans without getting anything from outside. That should be one of the possibilities. What is that? What would that possibility look like? First thing, if I just take the economic and monetary sovereignty, please, if you are African, Africa, you are an African, Start by implementing all the financial institutions that you created. All the institutions that you created, Jane talked about a few, the mining strategy. There are so many things in the African Union that we don't implement. Just stop any collaboration with people outside there and implement what you have in Africa, see what the results are, and mark the gaps and see where you can go and get support. We don't have that mindset. That's part of what we were trying to say when we said something before.
Yeah, thank you so much for the different comments. I think they are quite insightful. I just want to comment on, I think, a point that, 2 points. So one of the issues I wanted to highlight is to try and clarify the point around delinking. And I think the point that Jen made is important about the ideology, because part of what we need as a continent is to delink ourselves from the existing ideology that has made us assume that the only way in which we are going to develop, for instance, is if we are exporting externally, or if we are relying on foreign direct investments coming into our countries, and so forth and so on. But the other point also I wanted to make is that while I agree that economic sovereignty is negotiated, like Jen said, I think we're at a point where we also need to take it by force. And the point I want to make is also coming from the labor union. And one of the things that is happening is that when you think about the ways in which our economic systems are structured, capital is constantly rewarded while labor is exploited. And when you think about, for instance, some of the proposals that are made by the IMF, by the World Bank, but particularly the IMF, when it comes to us addressing our debt concerns, issues around fiscal consolidation, all these ultimately affect labor, affect workers. And just to highlight, for example, the challenge that we have is that we are not looking at how do we spur development, but we are looking at how do we address inflation. And that has been IMF's rule book when it comes to them engaging our governments. So they are constantly proposing ways of addressing inflation, reducing the amount of disposable income we have, reducing wages, capping wages, increasing indirect taxes, and the list goes on and on. And for me, that is why I would like to argue that we are at a point where we need to be able to take this sovereignty by force, because there is no reason why, for instance, a country like Nigeria, a country like Kenya, has worked out ways to address their debt challenges by merely reducing investment in people. So reducing subsidies and basically implementing policies that are directly affecting the population, just so that they can be able to get back into better rating, so that they can be able to improve their credit ratings. Because when you think about even the argument around credit rating, the focus is usually on, do you have an ability to pay? Are you willing to pay? So when governments take some of these very problematic policies and implement them, they are signaling a willingness to pay, but it's directly affecting the people within, it's directly affecting their citizens. And I think when we talk about debt, we need to get to a point where we also just decide that we will not pay certain debts. And that for me is part of being able to say that we are taking back economic sovereignty by force, because it's enough with the negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to think about the hard-hitting points that I can make, but it's like a huge conversation we will have to make. But just Dr. Kiza, just to respond to you about, the Africa debt settlement. I mean, my first concern would be that we've got, like Professor was saying, the greatest natural resources on the continent, the biggest extractive industries on our continent. But when it comes to pricing copper, for example, we've got to look at the London Metals Exchange or the Singapore Metals Exchange. I think the first point would be to think about an African metals exchange and what do we do to be able to get there. And then Jane, I'm really struggling with trying to understand this point about negotiating, because from the entire conversations we've had around the international tax, trying to get to a new tax treaty, negotiation has not helped Africa at all. And the fact that even right now, coming from New York, we were able to see the way in which you've got the European Economic Bloc coming up and telling you that, we're no longer going to negotiate on taxing rights because we want to protect resident source taxation. Where does that leave Africa with its own economic sovereignty? So I'm really rethinking this entire political economy lens about, do we really need to negotiate sovereignty? It's ours, we need to take it, we need to stand up for it. I think immediately after the tax negotiations, the Chilean government basically said, we disagree with the entire UN process, we are stepping out. That is an exercise of sovereignty. The same thing we can do with our own debt contracts as we think about it in terms of how we can frame it. One last thing you touched on, ideology. I think if you go back, this old economist, Galbraith, he basically said that if you want to impoverish a nation, keep them on agriculture. So let them, spend their entire economy framed around agriculture, agricultural subsistence. Isn't that what the colonial model did for the African continent? We are like 80% agriculture, and we are importing, we are exporting, but we're not able to come up with our own factories for example, manufacturing the advanced chip. Kenya, we've got fluorspar, but we cannot set up a factory to value add fluorspar to create that advanced AI chip that goes into our phones, into our computers, into everything that powers the digital economy. Why? Because you signed the Paris Agreement, you've got to limit your GHG, and if you create a factory here, you're going to be basically violating the Paris Agreement. So isn't that, again, a capture of our economic sovereignty through rules and regulations? So that's what's bringing me to one point. There are certain red flags that we need to be able to spot when we are entering into negotiations with certain countries. But what are these red flags, right? Somebody will say it's boilerplate clauses. I disagree. You've got to be able to read into the fine print of power that comes in technology contracts, that comes in debt contracts, that comes in natural resources contracts, investment, trade, etc. But if we don't know what these red flags are, we're going to continue ceding the economic sovereignty going forward. So negotiations, nah, I'm not for negotiations anymore. Yeah, so we will have that discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought what you were saying is that, sovereignty is not given on a silver platter, that you have to fight for it. So, which is what the views the views coming out are. And I think I want to start on that sovereignty, whether it is economic or political, is about power. And real power is not given, nobody gives you freely, because power is a limited resource, and it can be, and everybody needs it. So no one is going to surrender on a silver platter. So if Africa wants to be sovereign, you have to grab it. You have to assert it. And if it's given by someone, it won't be real power. It won't be genuine power. It will be a form of control. And what I was trying to make in the lecture today was just that point, that Africa has to assert her power, or his power, whatever the pronoun you want to use. And that cannot be done by anyone from outside. I think there were questions that came, and Martin referred to that we have to do it ourselves. Because power can only be grabbed. It's not something that you negotiate with someone. It won't be genuine power. So that's the first point. The second point I want to make also is that you notice that we've been speaking about Africa as if it's one entity. This is an entity with 55 different countries. And for me, that is where the problem is. So of late, for those of you who have been following some debate about Africa's economic development, Jeffrey Sachs has been those of you, Jeffrey Sachs is an American economist that has now developed quite a strong interest in African affairs. And he's been saying that the only difference between China, so he starts off his argument by saying that China has 1.3 billion people. India has 1.4 billion people. The African continent has 1.4 billion people. The only difference, he says, India is one country, China is one country, Africa is 54 countries. And I think that is a major problem, because even if we say the continent, I mean, what we're saying about natural resources, these natural resources are split between 54 different countries, and those 54 different countries are influenced by forces outside. The war that somebody was talking about, that they'll come and bomb you, they'll create lack of security in the DRC. It's not accidental. The DRC, Central African Republic, Chad and Mali and even Burkina Faso, is a result of forces from outside that are trying to assert the status quo, that Mali should continue exporting uranium to France, because that's the way it has been. And of course, France benefits, but Mali doesn't benefit. And so African unity, I think, and this is the point I was trying to make earlier about Opa Kabejimpanga saying he's a Pan-Africanist. I think when you look at the problem on Africa, there's no other way but to be Pan-African, because that's the only solution there is. And we can't escape most of these things, including the settlement systems, for date or payment. Just an example of a settlement. Kenya sells tea to Ghana. Why do you have to get Ghana to get US dollars to buy Kenyan tea? There's no, rationally, there's no economic reason for you to go through the dollar. You can actually have a system where you trade in cedis and shillings. Yeah. And this idea has been floated. In we now, under the FCFTA, we do have what we call the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which is the idea that what we need to increase Africa or to facilitate this intra-Africa trade without going through the dollar is just, in a normal banking system, a clearing house. That's all you need. It's a house that says, Kenya bought this, and I am crediting you this, and then I'm debiting you this. And just that. We, again, out of lack of economic sovereignty, we have surrendered that autonomy to somebody, so that even if you're trading between Kenya and Tanzania, you still need the dollar. But technically you don't. But because we are still split, the Pan-African payment system at the moment has only a traction of 3%. That means that the transactions that go between African countries, only 3% of them go through the Pan-African payment system. We need to improve that, maybe at least take it to 10, 15, or 20%. It's not going there because we are still, perhaps out of a colonial mind, oriented towards the dollar as the main currency.
Apologies to interject, Prof, if you could just round up.
Yeah. So just to round up, I think on the question of hope, Martin, I think I also have hope. And I have hope for two reasons. One is that I work with young people in the university. And both at undergrad and postgrad level, and you can see that there is a shift in mentality, in changing, saying, why do we look outside? Even in teaching, if you're teaching economics, there's always saying, the students will always ask you, would that make sense here on the continent? And I think that, for me, is a reason for hope. The other reason why I have hope is perhaps the forum that we have today. So this, as I was saying earlier, is the advocacy for economic justice, for date justice, has not started today. And this discussion gives hope that we have continued raising issues. They might not be heard by any ministers or Reserve Bank governors or whatever, but the discussion is going, and perhaps what we can do is to put this in the public domain. And the African population or African citizenry is beginning to demand some of these things at the continental level. Like, for instance, the campaign #Borderless Africa is an example. So I have hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you to Dr. Leila, Ms. Faith, and Mr. Martin for responding and adding value to this important discussion. Key takeaway being political and economic sovereignty cannot be negotiated any longer. We need to grab it, and there is hope. So thank you to our respondents, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. From here, we will move to straight to our official opening, which will be held in the Kilimanjaro room on ground floor. And then just from the meeting room, we will go outside for a group photo before we move straight to the official opening. We have come to the end of our OPA lecture series. Thank you so much, comrades, for joining, and see you at the official opening.
This is